Prime time. Live television. The cameras are rolling, and the laughter comes too fast, too loud. Not the kind that rises naturally. This is the sound of anticipation. An audience sensing a moment and leaning forward, waiting for something to break. Jerry Lewis stands under the lights. America's golden conscience. The tireless host. The man applauded for doing good on a scale big enough to forgive almost anything. He holds the microphone a second longer than necessary. Just long enough to signal control. Then he says it. Not a punchline. Not an accident. A line aimed backward, sharp enough to reopen something unfinished. It doesn't attack directly. It suggests. And that's worse. The room tightens. A few people stop clapping. Others laugh late, unsure why they're laughing at all. Everyone understands who the words are meant for. Dean Martin steps into the light. No script in his hand. No prepared smile. No visible defense. He doesn't rush. He doesn't look angry. He looks steady. Almost detached. This isn't a comeback. It isn't a feud revived for ratings. It's something more dangerous. A moment where silence might say more than any joke ever could. And when Dean finally responds, he doesn't raise his voice, doesn't deny the past, doesn't reach for sympathy. He does something far more unsettling. He takes control by refusing to fight. What happens next doesn't explode. It settles, and in that quiet, an entire story changes forever. America learned to remember Martin and Lewis as lightning in a bottle. What it forgot, or never saw, was how unstable that bottle was from the first night it was sealed. In 1946, no one walked into the clubs of Atlantic City expecting history. The rooms were narrow, ceilings stained yellow by years of smoke, tables packed so tight that laughter had nowhere to escape. Veterans were back from the war, restless and loud. Women dressed sharply, men drank hard, and everyone wanted distraction. Comedy wasn't art there. It was survival. Dean Martin arrived like someone passing through, rather than chasing something. Immaculate suit, relaxed shoulders, voice that seemed to slow the room without effort. Jerry Lewis arrived like a storm, talking, pacing, adjusting everything that wasn't nailed down. Their pairing wasn't born of chemistry. It was arithmetic. Chaos plus calm. Noise plus control. From the beginning, the imbalance was structural. Jerry decided entrances, timing, interruptions. He wrote the beats where Dean was meant to sing, and the beats where he was meant to be cut off. Dean stood center stage, but Jerry owned the rhythm beneath his feet. Off stage, Jerry spoke openly, sometimes loudly, about replaceability. Singers came and went, he said. Gags didn't. On stage, the audience laughed so hard they missed the shift. Jerry would interrupt Dean mid-line, derail a song with a scream or a fall. It played as comedy, but the laughter landed differently each time. Dean noticed which jokes drew laughs and which drew power. He noticed when the humor stopped being shared and started being aimed. The jokes about drinking came early, not as a persona yet, more like testing a blade. Jerry would glance at Dean's glass, roll his eyes, toss a remark that suggested indulgence, weakness, unreliability. The crowd laughed because crowds always laugh first. Dean smiled because that's what professionals do. But he remembered the timing. He remembered who benefited. Backstage, the air was colder than the rooms outside. Contracts were discussed around him, not with him. Decisions were made fast, signed faster. It wasn't until a quiet conversation with a nervous accountant, someone who assumed Dean already knew, that the numbers became clear. Control, approvals, creative authority. None of it leaned his way. He wasn't furious. He didn't argue. He folded the knowledge neatly and put it somewhere permanent. Night after night, the rooms filled. Women came for Dean's voice, stayed for Jerry's chaos, and left remembering a combination that felt inevitable. Dean watched it happen with the patience of someone studying weather. He didn't push back. He didn't correct the narrative. He let success do what success always does: speed everything up before anyone asks if it's stable. By the early 1950s, they were untouchable in public and brittle in private. Jerry needed control the way others needed applause. Dean needed space and learned how to create it without noise. When Jerry spoke over him, Dean adjusted. When a joke landed too close to the bone, Dean let it pass. Not because it didn't matter, but because he was counting. The country saw a partnership. What existed was a formula under strain, held together by money, momentum, and silence. Dean understood something early that would take others decades to see. Not every battle announces itself. Some arrive smiling, wearing success, waiting to be remembered later. By 1956, the rooms were larger, and the silence backstage had grown sharper. The marquees still carried both names, stacked like a promise, but the alignment was no longer equal. What had once been friction disguised as momentum had hardened into distance. They traveled together without moving toward each other. The final performances were efficient, almost surgical. Timing was perfect, because it had to be. Improvisation disappeared between them, replaced by precision that felt cold to anyone who knew how alive it once had been. Behind the curtain, they didn't argue. They didn't negotiate. They barely acknowledged one another. The absence of conflict was its own warning sign. On the last night, Jerry adjusted the show minutes before curtain. Small changes. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to tilt the balance. On stage, he leaned harder into control, interrupting earlier, stretching bits longer, forcing Dean into narrower spaces. Then came the line. Casual. Tossed out like an afterthought. A joke about timing, about someone not quite keeping up. The audience laughed automatically. Dean didn't miss the implication. He also didn't respond. He finished the set cleanly, professionally, and walked off without looking back. The press didn't wait for both of them. The next morning, Jerry was already seated at a table lined with microphones. He spoke calmly, confidently, using language that sounded mature and inevitable. He talked about evolution, about needing new challenges, about being ready to move forward. It was framed as progress, not fracture. Dean's name surfaced only indirectly, as part of a chapter that had simply ended. Dean learned about the conference the same way he'd learned about the contracts, secondhand. No call, no warning, just headlines suggesting withdrawal, weakness, retreat. The absence of his voice was interpreted as guilt. Silence, once strategic, became suspicious. Studios reacted quickly. Meetings were polite, shorter than before. Scripts came thinner. Roles shifted from leads to considerations. Offers arrived with reduced numbers, careful language, lowered expectations. Executives spoke about audience association as if it were a medical condition. They didn't say he couldn't stand alone. They said they weren't sure the public would let him. Dean didn't correct them. He took the smaller roles, accepted the quieter rooms, traveled without an entourage. He stopped explaining himself because explanations invited debate, and debate implied doubt. Instead, he worked. He listened. He adjusted. Not to please anyone, but to survive the moment intact. What the public read as disappearance was recalibration. He wasn't licking wounds. He was conserving energy. Every appearance was deliberate. Every choice stripped of excess. While others speculated, Dean observed how quickly loyalty shifted, how reputation bent under suggestion, how easy it was for a narrative to harden if left alone. He never contradicted Jerry publicly. Not once. No statements. No interviews correcting the record. That restraint cost him in the short term. It also preserved something else, his credibility with himself. The partnership ended loudly without him speaking a word. And in that quiet, something irreversible happened. Dean Martin stopped performing for approval. What followed would no longer depend on who left first or who spoke loudest, but on who lasted. The industry expected a verdict. By the early 1960s, it thought it had one. Dean Martin didn't return by force. He reappeared through atmosphere. Las Vegas suited him in ways the coasts never had. The rooms were wide, the lights low, the pace unhurried. He didn't need to chase laughter there. He let it come to him. On stage, his movements looked casual, almost lazy, but nothing was unplanned. Pauses were measured. Silences were placed like notes. He controlled the room without raising his voice, without asking permission. The image worked because it felt unguarded. The drink in his hand, the loosened tie, the half-smile. Audiences believed they were watching effortlessness. They didn't see the discipline behind it. They didn't see how every beat had been refined until it could survive interruption. Dean had learned long ago that calm, unsettled people more than confrontation ever could. Around him, the Rat Pack formed not as a strategy, but as gravity. Sinatra's intensity, Davis's edge, Lawford's polish, all of it orbiting a center that refused to compete. Dean didn't lead by assertion. He led by removing friction. In rooms full of ego, that absence became power. Jerry Lewis was succeeding just as visibly, but on a different frequency. He filled theaters and television screens with motion and volume. His humor grew larger, more physical, more relentless. He wasn't just a comedian anymore. He was an institution. Telethons turned him into a symbol. Tireless, moral, necessary. Applause followed him not for surprise, but for expectation. He delivered exactly what people believed he represented. The contrast sharpened with time. Dean's success felt sideways, almost accidental. Jerry's felt vertical, constantly climbing. They occupied the same decade without sharing the same temperature. One relied on stillness, the other on momentum. One let time pass through him. The other tried to outrun it. The invitation arrived wrapped in diplomacy. A network special. A shared appearance. Language carefully chosen. Reunion. Celebration. History. Publicly, it was positioned as healing. Privately, it carried weight. Live television didn't allow revision. Whoever controlled the tone would control memory. Dean understood the risk immediately. He knew what live cameras did to old dynamics. He knew how easily familiarity could be turned into dominance. And he knew something else. Declining would look like avoidance. Acceptance would look like courage or consent. He didn't consult a publicist. He didn't negotiate conditions beyond the basics. He said yes with the same economy he'd learned to apply to everything else. Not because he wanted closure, because he didn't want fear making the decision for him. In the weeks before the broadcast, Jerry prepared obsessively. Jokes were tested, rewritten, sharpened. He framed the appearance as a moment of generosity, allowing the past to return under his terms. He believed control would be effortless. After all, it always had been. Dean prepared differently. He didn't rehearse responses. He didn't anticipate lines. He paid attention to something subtler. How it felt to sit across from someone who once needed to dominate him. He noticed that the feeling no longer carried weight. When the night approached, both men were successful. Both were secure. But only one of them walked into that studio without needing the outcome to confirm anything. The studio. Lights flattened everything. Color disappeared under them, leaving only contrast. Faces, shadows, movement. In 1969, live television still carried risk, and everyone in that room felt it. There was no delay, no soft edit waiting to fix a mistake. Whatever happened would belong to the moment forever. They were seated side by side, angled slightly toward the audience. Familiar posture, familiar distance. The applause arrived on cue, warm and long, fueled by memory more than expectation. Jerry accepted it with practiced ease, smiling broadly, leaning into the recognition. Dean nodded once, restrained, acknowledging without feeding it. Jerry began with nostalgia, stories framed as shared triumphs. The language was generous on the surface. Two kids, impossible odds, America laughing together. The audience relaxed. Laughter came easily, safely. Then, without changing volume, Jerry shifted tone. He referenced guidance, direction, leadership. He suggested, lightly, cleverly, that some careers required steering, that not everyone knew where to go without it. The words landed, and something stalled. It wasn't silence yet, more like hesitation, a fraction too long between setup and laughter. People looked at each other before responding. Jerry smiled through it, sensing resistance but pressing forward. The rhythm was still his, but it no longer felt automatic. The control room reacted before the audience did. A camera tightened on Dean. Close enough to catch detail, far enough to avoid intrusion. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. His hands rested loosely, unguarded. No crossed arms, no defensive shift. He looked neither surprised nor offended. He looked present. The pause stretched. Not dramatically, just enough to disrupt instinct. Laughter came late, thinner than before. The room adjusted uncomfortably. Dean still hadn't moved. Jerry felt it. He had spent his life reading rooms, and this one was changing temperature. He responded the way he always had, by escalating. Another joke, sharper now. A reference dressed as humor, pointing toward reputation, indulgence, unreliability. The kind of line that once landed cleanly because the audience had been trained to accept it. This time, it split the room. Some laughed reflexively. Others didn't at all. The sound fractured, uneven. For the first time that night, the energy didn't return to Jerry. It hovered, uncertain. He waited for the familiar swell. It didn't come. Dean turned his head slowly, not toward Jerry, but toward the audience. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. He adjusted the microphone with care, as if considering whether it was worth using. The stillness amplified everything Jerry had just said without repeating a word. Live television doesn't forgive imbalance. It exposes it. Jerry filled the space instinctively, but the cadence was off. His momentum had nowhere to go. He glanced toward Dean, expecting engagement, deflection, banter, anything to restore the old exchange. What he saw instead was composure untouched by provocation. The audience felt it before they understood it. This wasn't comedy slipping. It was control shifting. Dean hadn't spoken yet, but the room was already listening to him. Dean lifted the microphone as if testing its weight, rather than claiming the floor. The movement was unremarkable, almost modest, but it redirected the room. He didn't rush. He didn't signal that a punchline was coming. That alone unsettled expectation. He spoke without sharpening his voice. He didn't reject what had been said. He didn't counter it. He acknowledged parts of it plainly. Yes, they had been different. Yes, Jerry had driven the chaos, pushed the pace, filled every gap with motion. Dean didn't frame this as generosity. He stated it as fact. The audience, trained to expect defense or irony, didn't know where to land. There was no smile to cue laughter, no pause inviting it either. His tone stayed even, steady enough to feel almost private despite the cameras. That steadiness disarmed the moment more effectively than outrage ever could. Then he shifted the ground. He moved away from questions of importance, away from credit or authorship. He spoke instead about work, long drives between cities, cheap hotels, rooms where silence was louder than applause. He mentioned nights when nothing landed, when jokes collapsed and songs barely held the air. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't dramatize it. He described it as labor. For the first time, the audience stopped listening for conflict and started listening for meaning. Dean spoke about survival without framing it as victory, about how two people could come out of the same pressure shaped differently. He didn't say one way was better. He didn't suggest comparison. He simply acknowledged divergence. "We both made it," he said carefully. "Just not the same way." The room slowed. Applause hovered, unsure whether it was invited. Jerry remained still beside him, hands folded, watching something he hadn't planned for. Dean turned fully toward the audience now. Not performatively, just enough to redirect focus. His gaze didn't scan the crowd. It settled, as if addressing someone specific rather than everyone at once. "I never wanted to win," he said. The sentence was quiet, stripped of ornament. "I wanted to stay who I was." He didn't let the line linger. He didn't underline it. He placed the microphone back where it had been and leaned away, signaling completion rather than challenge. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It was suspended. A few seconds stretched long enough to feel deliberate. No laughter rushed in to rescue the moment. No applause arrived to close it neatly. Jerry smiled reflexively, prepared to move on, but something had shifted beyond recovery. The exchange had ended without a verdict, without triumph. Control hadn't been seized. It had been released. Viewers at home felt it without naming it. Something unresolved had passed through the screen. Not a scandal, not a reconciliation, an exposure. Dean hadn't defended himself. He hadn't corrected history. He had reframed it without asking permission. And the room knew, instinctively, that the most powerful response that night had arrived without force and left without noise. The broadcast ended the way live television always does, too quickly. Applause filled the studio on cue, lights dimmed, and the illusion of resolution settled over the audience. But backstage, nothing aligned that neatly. The air was restless, charged with conversations that didn't quite begin. Jerry expected something. An explanation, perhaps. A reaction. He had lived his life inside feedback loops. Laughter, noise, response. He followed Dean down the corridor, words already forming, energy still high. What he found instead was restraint that bordered on detachment. Dean didn't linger. He removed the microphone wire himself, thanked a stagehand, adjusted his jacket. When Jerry finally spoke, it wasn't confrontation. It was confusion disguised as familiarity. A comment about timing, about how live shows always ran strange. Dean nodded, once. He said he was tired. He mentioned an early flight. The exchange lasted seconds. No analysis, no reckoning. Jerry stood there with momentum, and nowhere to spend it. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Jerry remained wired, pacing slightly, replaying the moment aloud to anyone who would listen. Dean moved slowly, deliberately, conserving energy as if the night had taken something finite and valuable. Industry reaction arrived before the audience could articulate what they'd seen. In quiet corners and unrecorded conversations, producers didn't talk about jokes. They talked about discomfort, about a rhythm that felt dated colliding with one that didn't ask for approval. Someone remarked that the room had leaned toward silence instead of sound. Someone else said nothing at all, which said more. No names were attached to these observations. They floated, unclaimed, but understood. Executives had built careers on reading tone, and the tone had shifted. The performance that night hadn't embarrassed anyone, but it had revealed something irreversible. One style demanded attention. The other commanded it by refusing to. Offers followed. Not announcements, feelers. Ideas floated about future appearances, about capitalizing on unfinished business. Dean declined them quietly. No statements, no conditions, just a polite no, delivered through intermediaries. The choice surprised people more than anger would have. Refusal didn't fit the narrative they were hoping to revive. For Dean, the decision felt simple. He wasn't retreating. He was choosing direction. The broadcast had clarified something he hadn't fully articulated before. He no longer needed proximity to his past to validate his present. The stage he occupied now didn't require old dynamics to generate relevance. He left Los Angeles without ceremony. Back to Vegas. Back to rooms where control didn't require volume, where silence could breathe without being filled. On stage, nothing changed. Off stage, everything had. Jerry continued forward, as he always had, but something lingered. The night had slipped from his grip not through failure, but through restraint he couldn't mirror. The story didn't end in confrontation. It closed in divergence. One man chased continuity, the other stepped beyond it. And in that choice, unannounced, uncelebrated, the balance finally settled. Time did what the broadcast could not. It softened the edges, rearranged priorities, and quietly edited memory. In the days after the show, newspapers searched for quotes and found very few worth printing. No scandal followed, no public reckoning. Critics wrote around the moment rather than about it. They described tone, atmosphere, an odd stillness that had settled over a segment meant to celebrate noise. Viewers called it uncomfortable, but not unpleasant. What lingered wasn't the joke. It was the pause that refused to be filled. Weeks passed, then months. People stopped mentioning what was said and started recalling what wasn't. Dean's restraint became the detail that refused to fade. He hadn't played a role. He hadn't leaned into nostalgia or grievance. He had simply been present. For an audience accustomed to performance, that absence of effort registered late but deeply. Jerry continued to work, to be visible, to fulfill the image he had spent decades building. Years later, during an interview that wasn't meant to carry weight, he was asked about the partnership. The question was casual. His answer was too honest to be strategic. He said Dean had always been calmer than he was. That calm, he admitted, wasn't something he'd ever learned how to use. There was no apology in the statement, no regret. Just recognition, delivered without flourish. Dean never responded. He didn't need to. By then, his nights followed a different rhythm. Las Vegas after midnight moved slower, and he moved with it. The rooms were full of people who didn't know the details of old rivalries or televised tension. They came to hear a voice, to feel time stretch instead of rush. Dean gave them that, song after song, without reference to anything unresolved. There was no sense of triumph in it, only continuity. He hadn't rewritten history. He had stepped out of its grip. The final measure of the story wasn't found in ratings or retrospectives. It lived in how the moment aged. Not explosively, but steadily, like something understood only after distance made it safe to examine. Dean Martin never claimed the last word. He didn't need it. He allowed silence to do what? Arguments couldn't. Redefine strength without naming it. When the lights dimmed and the room emptied, there was no echo of conflict following him off stage. Only the quiet certainty of a man who had refused to let someone else's voice decide who he became. And that restraint, unannounced, unrecorded, was the part everyone remembered.